I'd like to introduce our first speaker of the policy session, Sabine Apitz. Sabine is going to be talking about European environmental management moving to an ecosystems approach, 10 years on, examples and observations. I've already spoken to Sabine. She's got a very dense talk with lots of material, and I think there's a lot of interest in that. I'm going to, I know she's going to keep strictly to time, and I'm going to try and encourage that with all of our three speakers this morning. So without further ado, Sabine, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Bill. It's a pleasure to be here. Let's see, how does this work? European policy, and this is not an audience I need to tell this, has resulted in an expectation of ecosystem-based management of the environment from the land to the open sea, and different policies cover different regions. Now, this table we generated in 2006. Some of the policies now are not that new, but at the time we proclaimed a brave new world. Ecosystems were going to be at the center of our policy, and there would be integration across policies, environments, disciplines, and scales. It was quite a paradigm shift from the silo, sectoral management of the past, and it seemed to be a very exciting time. Well, it's been a few years now, and I'm going to speak to you as a skeptical enthusiast of the ecosystem approach and some observations of various attempts to apply it to a number of questions. So I find, even though ecosystem approach is mandated in a lot of sites, historical concerns mean often we're still very silo-focused. Chemical contamination still drives many decisions. So we're mandating presumptive remedies such as cleanup and removal rather than ecological balance or habitat restoration. There's a sort of eco-theocracy, a Garden of Eden concept, that nature is good, man is the interloper, and the goal of restoration should be returned to baseline conditions or an intact state. But we're here to stay, and at least for a while, and we are managing and changing landscapes. It's not feasible, nor is our baseline conditions consistent with ecological reality. Ecosystems are complex. They do change, and often change is irreversible. Now, if you look at the objectives and measures of a number of ecosystem-based statutes or policies, Water Framework Directive requires good ecological status, which focuses on minimal anthropogenic impact, while the European Marine Strategy allows for human use and sustainability. So statutes define their ecosystem goals differently, but with overlap that needs to be reconciled. As we develop targets and limits, we have to understand how complex ecosystems react to a myriad of pressures. Now, many models of ecosystem response focus on conditions under which ecosystem structures may shift between alternative stable states, where this is an initial state. After some pressure, you have a disturbed state. And after we recover things and return to a perfect system, we have this recovered state. However, in reality, the final state may be different than the original one. Ecosystems are not that simple. The concept of climax communities, which is almost the theology underlying a lot of assumptions, assumes alternative stable states, from trees to grassland or eelgrass to eutrophic conditions. But communities respond to environmental gradients, especially, I'm a marine scientist, we look at benthic ecosystems. You don't have bimodal systems. Systems have memory, and change is inherent and inevitable, whether anthropogenic or natural. Ecosystems are actually multidimensional and probably unknowable. So there can be multiple stable states, and all we can do is measure indicators of structure or function, but probably never fully define ecosystems or whether they're healthy or what they actually are. So system response, if we consider not ecosystem status or structure, but perhaps a specific service or function we're trying to monitor, responds to changes in biophysical status or pressure. So if we have a starting point, impair biophysical status, eventually we reach a tipping point and a reduction in status. If we improve things, we can have partial resilience. Things can return somewhat to original conditions for a specific status or function. We can have complete resilience, or if we enhance biophysical conditions relative to some condition, we can have enhanced status because of net biophysical improvement. Of course, if we damage things too badly, we get no resilience and irreversible damage. So the problem is this is just a conceptual slice through a multi-dimensional ecosystem space. We struggle to come up with measures to represent responses to what we can understand. And the trajectories and destinations will differ depending on the indicator or endpoint that we're assessing. So we need to be clear about what is to be protected or restored and how it's to be measured. We need to define the conceptual framework within which we're thinking, and it's particularly important as we manage systems with a backdrop of irreversible or long-term change. So state, success, and how we define starting points and what we are to measure affects how we decide whether we've succeeded and whether things are changing. We need to clearly define our models. So you need to say where you are, where we're starting, and what we're tracking. So Water Framework Directive and Marine Strategy Directive indicators are often based on community structure, which worms are there and which worms should be there. But in some systems, a focus on structure alone, especially in a shifting baseline, is going to set us up for failure. It's been said that probably diversity of function is more important for the sustainability of goods and services than species per se. Another ecologist that I really respect says we've lost the species battle. We need to protect the functions. So it's important to understand functions, their responses to pressures, and their relationship to ecosystem services. We need to ask, even if we've changed an ecosystem or a population, is this a functioning ecosystem? Are the landscapes providing us with what we need? Now, most of you have seen this decision cascade in one form or another. It's a pleasure to be in an audience where I don't have to explain it in detail. But whatever you're doing within an ecosystem services context, you're working somewhere within this circular iterative decision cascade. If we're trying to make a decision, we need to decide what the decision is, how that's going to change pressures and biophysical conditions, how that might change functions and services, and then how we value those, what we want to optimize, and what decision we want to make. Now, as you look at the different steps in that process, we've broken that down into a series of separate categories of assessment. One is ecosystem service decision analysis, another is assessment, and another is valuation. They don't work in isolation, but often the practitioners do. And this is often a problem. How ecosystem services are applied, valued, and communicated between steps ranges widely across applications, and therefore it can hinder its role as a cross-sectoral tool. It's very important that we're transparent about how we hand information off between these steps, and in my experience, that's not very well done. So if you talk about types of ecosystem service-based assessment, which is what I'm more interested in, how we use the information we can measure to inform policy and decisions, there are three rough categories of assessment. There's a resource level assessment, an ecosystem service-based response or regional assessment, and ecosystem service-based life cycle assessment. So RESA maps the extent of or potential trajectories of resources to identify baseline conditions or project trajectories of recovery or restoration. It estimates resource levels, but it doesn't provide a mechanistic evaluation of what drives changes, and it doesn't look at the interactions between ecosystem services. EcoRISA and EcoRISA enhance or underlie traditional risk assessment by linking risk assessments to ecosystem services. Endpoints are linked either to biophysical processes or functions. They can be simple or complex. They can be regionally or spatially explicit and cross-scale. But the focus is on assessing pathways of effect, not quantifying services. So they don't directly lead to evaluation, although some people aren't clear about this translation, although outputs can feed into evaluations and comparative assessments. Now, there's emerging ecosystem-based life cycle assessment, which evaluates the full scope of effects for a proposed policy, product, or development. Quantitative assessments can be very complex. They're achingly quantitative and often driven by economics and engineering. Most approaches that are currently applied that I've found in the literature don't look at non-provisioning services because they lack quantitative models. There's a scope for the development of more qualitative or semi-quantitative life cycle assessment to look at the full scope of impacts. Often leaving things out because you can't quantify them doesn't make things more accurate, it just makes things easier. These would help regional planning, strategic assessments, and scoping for liability assessment. Now, a couple key methods that are important to address when trying to understand and manage ecosystems. First of all, although integration is invoked in almost every study I've reviewed, multidisciplinary studies still often result in a stack of single discipline reports by scientists. What we get is this, and then we still don't know what to do with all the information. Now, this is really sexy if you're a scientist and an academic. It gives you a lot of publications, but it doesn't help us make decisions. Integration is still often an underfunded afterthought rather than a consideration in experimental design, and it's a problem for making our research meaningful. Now, again, this is a slide I don't really need to show here, but it's transitional. Different land use types result in different ecosystem service clusters. There are both intended and unintended consequences of all our land management choices. And it's a consideration of those trade-offs that we're trying to articulate more and more. So if you look at impacts from stressors, they can be driven by a number of factors. The risk for an ecosystem service impact, this is focusing on soil loss and sediment generation. There are intrinsic risk factors such as slope and soil type, as Jackie so eloquently invoked. There are management risk factors, the things we do to landscapes and how those interact with those intrinsic factors. And then there are connectivity parameters. If stressors are released, do they reach habitats, or are we controlling them? These require spatially explicit assessment, although often then we need to aggregate that information to higher scales. Not every assessment requires this level of complexity, but if we want to look at interactions, we need to look at the driving parameters. Now, if we look at management at the river basin at a large scale, you need to look at driving processes and mechanisms at multiple scales. Traditionally, the understanding is if you want to I can't really point at this at the focal scale, this is your focal scale, you always need to understand the processes one scale above and one scale below. I might not have pointed that quite, yeah, it's one scale above and one scale below. There are a number of tools and approaches that allow you to address multi-scale interactions, but it's not trivial. You do need to understand that as you move across scale, you can't just assume things extrapolate. Now, it's important also to remember that whether something is harmful or beneficial can be very context specific. In this case, a fine-grained soil or sediment released from a field, it can cause both positive and negative impacts depending on the location or habitat you're in, the endpoint you're considering, and the services you're concerned with. In this middle section, all the red arrows are undesirable impacts, while the green arrows are desirable impacts. It's important, if you want to manage sustainably, to balance the trade-offs between your objectives and consider all these things. If we control sediment to protect salmonids in spawning gravel, for example, you may have less fine-grained sediment in wetlands for your birds. So we manage landscape on land and water to optimize chosen ecosystem services. This affects the status downstream and ultimately affects the viability and sustainability of aquatic ecosystem services. You need spatially explicit models to evaluate this. It's also important that our regulatory and research focus is on the right issues, and this doesn't always happen. This is the North Sea off the coast of Britain. These are the areas affected by dredging and disposal, which are heavily regulated. These are the areas affected by beam trawling, which is much less regulated. If you really want to protect benthic ecosystem function, you have to ask whether we're regulating and managing the correct processes. So, uncertainty and complexity. Ecosystem frameworks evaluate potential impacts in very complex systems. They're highly variable and interactions are uncertain. No model, however much we pretend they are, is more accurate than our least certain parameter. And ignoring parameters for which we don't have firm quantitative data doesn't make them go away. So ecosystem service frameworks should only be as complex as they need to be, but broad enough to be relevant rather than pretty. And they need to be based on the context of the decision and the uncertainty of the process. There are many tools to start communicating and addressing uncertainty and variability. Adaptive management and decision-making helps us deal with an uncertain world, and it's important that we do this to avoid or respond to unintended consequences. Now, there are a number of concerns about ecosystem service-based assessments. A review of a literature said the vast majority of studies consider 5 or fewer ecosystem services, and almost a quarter consider only one in the literature. You can be forgiven for thinking that's not an ecosystem service assessment. It's a single resource assessment. More than 50% of the studies reviewed considered services in isolation without considering feedback or interaction. And there's a rather disturbing lack of clarity and consistency, breadth, and integration in a majority of applications. Assumptions and models behind valuations are often not explicit. So are the ecosystem approach and ecosystem service approach cross-sectoral tools, or are they greenwashing? Well, sometimes they're one, sometimes the other. Whether explicitly addressed or not, all management choices result in trade-offs. Ecosystem services can provide a thread for cross-sectoral decision-making. If policy and market changes are to support sustainability, it is essential that we understand how actions will affect a range of ecosystem services in space and time, but we need to be aware of the limits of our knowledge. Ecosystem service research models and tools should help government and stakeholders make more informed decisions, but this requires clarity, transparency, and relevance of approach. So how do we better manage ecosystems? We need to be connected because ecosystems are. We need to be skeptical and transparent because the devil is in the details. We need to be uncertain because the myth of certainty undermines our credibility. We need to be promiscuous because we need to use the best tools for the question at hand and not just the tools we already have a relationship with. We need to be humble because even simple systems have the capacity to surprise us. And we need to be adaptive. We need to monitor, adapt, respond, and communicate when we get things wrong or when systems, as they almost always do, prove to be more complex than we originally thought. Thank you.